Hello, I'm Tim Mayers from Millersville University of Pennsylvania. This talk is called Creative Writing Studies and Literary Studies, Converging Agendas, question mark. 15 years ago, I argued that whenever and wherever possible, creative writers and rhetoric and composition specialists should band together, secede from college and university English departments, and form their own departments of writing. And I meant it. I meant it because it had been my experience and the experience of many other early career professors from around the United States with whom I was talking at the time, that attempting to exist within English departments, especially when it came to discussions about curriculum and hiring, was becoming more and more unbearable for those who specialized in creative writing or rhetoric composition. Too many English departments had been, for so many decades, so completely dominated by literary studies that any serious discussion of structural change was met with, at best, a simple inability to understand, or at worst, outright hostility from literature teachers and scholars. I was convinced that creative writers and compositionists could only fully realize the possibilities of a collaboration if they left literary studies behind, at least at the institutional level. 15 years later, I no longer believe that. There are many reasons why. While the humanities writ large were not in great shape either institutionally or in the public eye during the first decade of the 21st century, conditions have deteriorated dramatically. Academic and underemployment among people with graduate degrees in English is perhaps worse than ever. Anti-intellectualism runs rampant in our society, and university finances are but one among many casualties of a global pandemic. It behooves us to consider ways that the various subfields in English studies might hang together, as Amy Devitt argues, not merely as a matter of institutional convenience, but also topically. And so I will argue here something I might once have found difficult to imagine, that we in creative writing studies could find common ground with at least some interpretive literary critics, and that we might build from this common ground some important curricular and pedagogical possibilities. Over roughly the past decade, at least a few interpretive academic literary critics have begun to take creative writing, both as a practice and as an institutional phenomenon, more seriously than ever before. Here I will briefly survey 4 books that I think illustrate this trend. Mark McGurl's The Program Era from 2009, Eric Bennett's Workshops of Empire from 2015, Hannah Sullivan's The Work of Revision from 2013, and Matthew Kirschenbaum's Track Changes from 2016. McGurl, with whom I imagine many in this audience are already familiar, and Bennett, both critics of 20th century American literature, each analyzed the creative writing program, especially, but not exclusively as MFA program, as an essential background condition that must be considered if the production and reception of literary writing in the United States are to be properly understood. McGurl's scope is ambitious. He reads the emergence, growth, and persistence of creative writing programs as manifestations of broad social, economic, technological, and demographic shifts. Bennett's book is more sharply focused on how creative writing programs were both influenced by and exerted an influence on Cold War ideology. Along the way, they both demonstrate how ideas that might seem natural or common sense to those trained in creative writing, and also to those who read their work, are actually reflections of larger forces. McGurl, for example, notes how the notion of writing as a craft, at least in its specific 20th century incarnation, may have developed because one of the previously underrepresented populations of students who flocked to universities after the Second World War, lower middle class white students, yearned to find solace in a type of work that could be understood as non-alienating. And Bennett demonstrates how some of the 20th century commonplaces about creative writing, like the advice show don't tell, flourished because they were compatible with American Cold War ideologies. Sullivan's and Kirschenbaum's arguments similarly analyze how some of the commonplaces of creative writing emerged from larger forces, but their focus is on what might be called the technologies of literary production. Sullivan argues and extensively demonstrates that the understanding of revision and the specific practices of revision filtered through decades of graduate creative writing workshops in the 20th century, so much so that they seem natural, given, and unquestionable, actually emerged during a particular historical moment that offered modernist writers what was then a new type of encounter with writing technologies. When a handwritten draft was worked into a typescript, writers were able to see their work again, differently, revision. And the new look of the text often prompted writers to make changes, sometimes significant, to what they had already done. That is, to revise. A similar thing occurred when the typescript was transformed into page proofs. A new look prompted reconsideration, which often prompted rewriting. While revision may seem a natural thing, something that every good writer does, Sullivan demonstrates that before the 20th century, most writers neither thought about revision nor engaged in it as extensive a practice of revision as 20th century writers did, particularly after modernism. Kirschenbaum performs a similar analysis, but his focus is on a late 20th century rather than an early 20th century writing technology, that is, the word processor. His analysis, by his own account, began with what seemed a rather straightforward and simple question. What was the first novel in English to have been completely composed and revised using a word processor? Kirschenbaum finds that his question is much more complex than he imagined. And along the way, through painstaking analysis of writers' works, their statements, pro and con, about working with word processors, and recoverable evidence of their writing practices, how the new tool changed the way writers thought about what they were doing, and how those changed patterns of thinking today might be getting so internalized that many of us believe they are natural, though they certainly are not. It may not yet be clear whether the books I've examined here suggest a significant large-scale development within literary studies, or merely the creation of a tiny, hyper-specialized niche of which literary studies already has too many to count. But, and I really want to emphasize this, the significance of these scholars' work is that it seems to shift the ground of academic literary study away from the question, what does this text mean, and toward the question, how was this text made? That latter question is of significant interest to those of us in creative writing studies, and we might, in this current and fraught institutional moment, use it to find common ground with some of our colleagues in English departments so that we might open up new pedagogical and curricular opportunities. I look forward to the conversation.